If you're in the business of developing and producing cars for decades, centuries even, year in and year out, trying to figure out what people want, trying to keep up with the trends, as CEOs and staff and departments come and go and evolve, there's just no getting around making a stinker every now and then. This video is about the ultimate stinkers because we're looking at the worst vehicle from every manufacturer, and this isn't just their worst car from, the 2026 lineup or whatever. This is the company's worst vehicle of all time, the biggest dud ever from each manufacturer. Note that I am focusing on manufacturers that are still around. So put on your seatbelt, get a nice cup of whatever you like to drink, get ready to comment your opinions down below. This is probably going to be a wild one. Now, before we get into the list, I know a lot of you guys are into not only cars and automotive history, but also watches. Many of you have found your way over to my watch channel. Well, I've got the perfect crossover for you, the Rec 956-106B DNA Edition, inspired by the legendary Porsche 956 106B Endurance Racer. This limited edition mono-pusher chronograph pays tribute to the 956's history. If you're a big Porsche or Le Mans fan, you know what I'm talking about. Each watch actually incorporates material from a Porsche 956 106B's clutch disc into the 30-minute counter, making every glance a direct link to Le Mans racing history. Powered by the Swiss Solida SW562 MP movement with a 62-hour power reserve, 41mm stainless steel case, sapphire crystal, and this motorsport-inspired design, things like the skeletonized lugs and a rotor modeled after the 956's BBS wheels, make this piece both mechanically impressive but also visually striking. With only 508 pieces for the Richard Lloyd Racing Edition and 448 pieces for the Liqua Moly Edition being made, you definitely need to check this out. These won't last. These watches are so cool because they're a piece of motorsport history that you can wear. As you guys might know, I'm a big fan of this company. I've worked with Rec a lot. I actually own their amazing Lotus 98T watch, which is just spectacular. So check out the 956 watch using the link below and act fast. This timepiece is currently in pre-order, meaning you can right now get 20% off, and by using my coupon code BART, that's B-A-R-T, you get an additional 10% off. Big thanks to Rec for sponsoring this video, and let's jump in. Let's kick things off by looking at the American manufacturers, and specifically Ford. The worst vehicle to ever bear the Ford name has to be the Mustang II. I know for a lot of you there's the Pinto, a car so cheaply designed, it was not only prone to exploding, but a slow rear-end collision could literally kill passengers. And yes, the Edsel project was a massive business failure, but the early Mustang II especially was offensively bad. It took the name of one of the greatest American cars ever and slapped it on that horrible Pinto platform with wheezy little four-cylinder engines making like 88 horsepower, dull handling, and styling that really stripped away everything that made the Mustang iconic. Mind you, I'm mostly talking about the base trim Mustang. Now, it did sell in decent numbers during the fuel crisis, but in hindsight, it stands as really a betrayal of the Mustang legacy. The Pinto was bad, but making a Mustang on the Pinto platform to me is worse. It's almost as bad as if they put the Mustang name on like an electric crossover. Imagine. Lincoln and really all of the major American manufacturers are so difficult because the history is there. I mean, Lincoln has had its fair share of flops, but in my mind, there is one single vehicle that has to be included on this list, the Lincoln Blackwood. A cool name, but a poor execution of a vehicle in almost every way. Introduced in 2002, the Blackwood was Lincoln's attempt to capitalize on this emerging luxury SUV truck market, but it was the execution that made it so bad. While marketed as a luxury pickup truck, it didn't really have any of the features that truck buyers actually wanted. Most notably, it had no four-wheel drive option, which made it essentially useless for, doing truck things. Its truck bed was covered with a non-removable, power-operated tonneau cover and lined with carpet and stainless steel trim, making it basically impractical for any real utility. Fake wood grain paneling that people found really tacky and out of place, and priced at over $52,000, an eye-watering sum at that time. It failed to offer either the ruggedness expected from a truck or the polish that you expected from a luxury vehicle. Consumers didn't bite, and Lincoln ended production after just one model year with fewer than 3,500 units sold. The Blackwood was a clear example of a vehicle trying to be everything at once and ending up being good at nothing. And it also really showed that traditional luxury elements wouldn't be enough for this new luxury truck market. For whatever reason, luxury truck people, they want all the crap that they'll never use. Now, it's difficult to talk about blunders in automotive manufacturing without mentioning the Chevrolet Vega. Now, sometimes cars are major misses solely because of lazy execution. That wasn't necessarily the case with the Vega. Its aluminum engine block was innovative on paper, but it was totally inadequate in practice, warping and overheating without proper cooling, leading to head gasket failure, oil burning, and often just full-on engine death. Pair that with atrocious rust issues from missing fender liners and poor rust proofing, faulty rear axles, throttles that could jam, just a rushed development process that I guess wasn't concerned with quality control, and you get what many consider kind of the archetypal American lemon from this era. Listen, the 70s was a rough time, especially for American manufacturers. The first generation Buick Enclave is often regarded as Buick's worst vehicle ever, and really it's the 2008 model in particular that racks up the most reported problems: frequent transmission failures, stretched timing chains that damage the engine, power steering malfunction, and just a whole host of electrical gremlins, bad gas gauges, lift gates, HVAC actuator failures. Reports have shown that these issues crop up early for these vehicles. So if you're perusing used cars and you stumble upon a low-mile 2008 Enclave, just keep scrolling. Don't be tempted. It's not worth it, even if you fancy yourself a mechanic. Of course, GM as the umbrella company is partly responsible for these cars, but has GMC specifically had any truly horrible vehicles? Well, as a whole, I don't think GMCs are very highly regarded anyways, but it's the first generation Acadia that has to be mentioned, affectionately known by mechanics as the official car of blown engines. A good way to test the quality of a vehicle is to just look around and see if you still see them. You know, if a car is only a decade or a little more old and they're nowhere to be seen on the road, that's probably not good. That means that they all blew up or were thrown away, and that's pretty much the case, especially with these first-gen Acadias. They all just exploded. The Cimarron might be not only the worst Cadillac ever, but perhaps the worst luxury vehicle of all time as well, and the worst example of badge engineering. It's just everything wrong with GM in the 80s personified in one car. Essentially, this was the J platform with just some chintzy fabric upgrades. It was a Cavalier with leather interior and nothing else, and the Cavalier at this time wasn't good. And in many ways, this was the beginning of a turn for Cadillac away from their great heritage as the American luxury brand to making a lot of overpriced garbage, leaving the big block V8, poor build quality. The Cimarron is the worst Cadillac because it was the first Cadillac to not really be a Cadillac. All right, let's talk about Jeep, shall we? Is there a good Jeep? Maybe that's the more interesting question. I'm kidding. I want to say the worst Jeep ever is the Compass, especially the early ones. All of these like Fiat rebadges, they're just so bad, so cheaply made, and overpriced. Reliability is bad even by Jeep and Stellantis standards. Just avoid these. But you know what, actually, I think I'm going to go a different direction. I think the new Jeep Wagoneer is not just offensive to the great Wagoneer name. It's not just a gigantic oaf of a vehicle. Electrical glitches plague it, power steering dies, infotainment systems freeze, features like lane assist stop working for no reason, the build quality is not good, panels misaligned, trim that just pops out, paint and clear coat peeling, and you'd hope that with insanely high prices would come excellent dealer support and usability, but no. Features that you thought would be standard are locked behind expensive option packages, and when things go wrong, dealership fixes are slow or ineffective. It doesn't inspire confidence when a supposedly beefy premium Jeep, it's just a giant hot mess in many ways, and if you read through reviews, you'll see this is true. So, in my opinion, the Wagoneer comeback, it should have been something like the Bronco, which isn't perfect either, but this is just, it's not what the Wagoneer was supposed to be. I feel bad saying that this is the worst Dodge ever because I'm pretty sure my sister had one, but then again, I think back and I'm pretty sure she had endless problems with it. Yeah, it's the Dodge Intrepid. Where do you even start with this car? It doesn't even look remotely good, but on top of that, the Intrepid, especially the early ones, have a notorious reputation for serious reliability issues. Owners reported rampant oil sludge buildup that would choke the engine, even despite regular maintenance, often leading to sudden engine failure around, 80,000 miles. On top of that, transmission problems, electrical glitches, cooling system failures, rapid depreciation, and so it wouldn't take much for repairs to essentially total the car. This is just another one of those cheap used vehicles that you might stumble upon that you have to avoid. Just avoid it. Now, I'm not going to say the worst Chrysler ever is the PT Cruiser because it's not. That was a cool car, okay? Also, people like to point to the Maserati Chrysler collab thing that was basically a LeBaron. Not the worst offense in my opinion. No, it's pretty clearly the Sebring because it managed to fail on pretty much every front. Launched as this stylish, affordable midsize meant to appeal to the masses, but what you got was underpowered, incredibly unreliable engines, harsh and noisy driving dynamics, and some of the cheapest interiors of this era. And the convertible, good lord, it's so bad. The Sebring epitomized Chrysler's mid-2000s decline when quality control really collapsed and the company flooded dealerships with uninspiring, cheaply built cars. By the end of its run, the Sebring was really a symbol of everything wrong with Chrysler at the time, despite the fact that Michael Scott drove one. Our final American brand that we have to look at is, of course, Tesla. Now, if you've been around this channel for any length of time, you could probably guess that my pick is the Cybertruck, and I feel like it's the obvious one. I mean, it's hard to argue. It's a complete mass market failure, perhaps the single most polarizing, well, I would say the most disliked vehicle of the 21st century, a symbol of excess and hype as a once relevant and cutting-edge car brand slowly fades into irrelevance, convincing us all that they don't need to make cars anymore. They just need to make robots. Despite what the stock prices tell you, colonizing Mars is never going to happen, and even if it did, whoever ends up there, what makes them any more likely to want to drive a Cybertruck than humans here on Earth? Okay, let's look at some Japanese manufacturers. Now, Toyota is a tough one because, of course, they're mostly known for bulletproof reliability, efficient engineering, and cars that run forever. But even Toyota can stumble, and to me, the standout dud has to be the Toyota Paseo. Released in the early 90s as a sort of budget, sporty coupe, it was meant to bring the fun of the Celica at a lower price point, but that didn't happen. It had the same underpowered engine as the economy Tercel, bland styling made it look like a melted Camry, and there was just nothing sporty about it. Motor Trend says this about the car's driving experience. The soul-sucking understeer bias of this chassis made driving the Paseo about as enjoyable as an evening watching Lawrence Welk reruns with grandma. Sales were dismal, and so it disappeared as quickly as it arrived. When people say Toyota makes boring cars, they're not just talking about the great reliable bulletproof sedans, it's also because of cars like the Paseo. Uninspired, underpowered, and totally forgettable. For Lexus, I think the obvious answer is the HS. Marketed in 2009 as Lexus's first dedicated hybrid, it was basically a rebadged Japanese market Toyota with some leather slapped inside, and it showed. It didn't look like a Lexus, it didn't feel like a Lexus, and it certainly didn't drive like one, like a lot of Lexus's new vehicles. People who purchased these complained about cheap materials, a noisy, droning hybrid drivetrain, and all for like 35 grand. And by 2012, it was gone, if that tells you anything. It was supposed to represent the future of Lexus, but instead it became really a cautionary tale. Lexus buyers, may want efficiency, but not if it feels like you're paying for pretty much a dressed up Prius, which is what most owners found. Now, compared to some of the other companies we've looked at, Honda's bar for bad is quite different. For the most part, there are no truly horrible Hondas. Most of their bad cars have just been boring, ugly, or kind of missed the market, rather than being catastrophically unreliable or dangerous. The Cross Tour wasn't great for sure, but I would say that the Passport probably should take the crown because it wasn't even really a Honda at all. The first generation Passport, built from the mid-90s into the early 2000s, was basically a rebadged Isuzu Rodeo. Buyers thought that they were getting Honda's trademark reliability, but instead they got rust-prone frames, spotty build quality, and constant mechanical headaches. It was a cynical shortcut from a company known for engineering excellence, and it ended up being one of the only Hondas that could genuinely be called bad. Nissan, on the other hand, has a much longer list of candidates, but if I had to crown one, it would be the Nissan Murano Cross Cabriolet. The idea for this vehicle was to take a perfectly fine Murano SUV, chop the roof off, and sell it as a convertible crossover. The result was one of the ugliest, most impractical, most confusing cars of the last 20 years. It was expensive, heavy, bizarrely styled, and none of the fun of a true convertible, and none of the utility of an SUV. Nobody bought it, it was mocked relentlessly, and has since become a sort of ironic cult classic. But when your $45,000 convertible SUV is remembered pretty much as a meme, I think you've failed. Sometimes bad vehicles bring about irreparable damage to the brand. The Infiniti QX60 is one of those vehicles. It actively dragged Infiniti's reputation down by proving that the company was content to slap a luxury badge on a Nissan and call it a day. Instead of pushing the boundaries like the G35 and FX once did, the QX60 stood as a symbol of mediocrity, showing buyers that Infiniti had lost its way and making it harder than ever for this brand to claw back any real credibility. These SUVs depreciated like crazy. They were known for having horrible ride quality, bad interior. Now, it has been revamped in recent years, but those early QX60s are something that I'm sure Infiniti wishes they could go back on. Subaru has its cult following, and for good reason, all-wheel drive, quirky styling, solid engineering, fun vehicles that are affordable too. Now, there is the horrible B9 Tribeca, launched in 2005 as their first proper three-row SUV. It came out looking like, well, nobody knew what they were looking at, but let's not focus on the poor Tribeca. I actually think that the Subaru 360 is the worst Subaru. When it hit the US in 1968, it was a disaster, designed as really a Japanese K car. It was painfully underpowered, dangerously flimsy, and so slow that Consumer Reports famously dubbed it as the most unsafe car in America, with a 0 to 60 time of 4.5 days. There was virtually no crash safety. The 360 really tanked Subaru's reputation before it ever got started. Instead of introducing Americans to, rugged, practical cars that Subaru would later be known for, the 360 became one of the worst launches in automotive history. Now, Mazda usually nails design and obviously driving dynamics, but the 626 from the late 90s into the early 2000s was an exception. Built during a period when Mazda was financially strapped and also under Ford's thumb, the 626 was plagued by weak automatic transmissions that failed early and often. Beyond that, the car just felt cheap and uninspired compared to its rivals. While not as hideous or bizarre as some of the cars on this list, it failed in the one area that Mazda is supposed to shine, making cars that people actually enjoy driving. And finally, we get to Mitsubishi, a company that has had some legendary cars like the Evo, but plenty of duds as well. I think for many, the Mirage is the obvious choice. Statistically speaking, it's, I think, the deadliest modern car to drive, but that's mostly because it's just so much smaller than everything else. Although I guess maybe that isn't entirely true. No, I'm going to go a different route. I feel bad ripping on early electric cars. The early Chevy Bolt was terrible in many of the same ways, but for me, the Mitsubishi i-MiEV was supposed to be the company's electric future, but in practice, it was a tiny, underpowered, unusable vehicle with a range barely reaching 40 to 50 miles, cramped interiors, and pretty much zero performance. It was a car that could only survive in city limits, and even then, barely. Expensive for what it offered, awkward to drive. It kind of became a symbol of Mitsubishi's missteps. It was ahead of its time in at least the idea or in concept, but completely out of touch with what drivers actually needed. One of the boldest failures in recent automotive history, for sure. Now let's quickly cover the few South Korean manufacturers. Now Hyundai for sure have made a name for themselves in the last few decades as a reliable and pretty well-regarded manufacturer, but they did once make a thing called the Entourage. Introduced in the mid-2000s as a minivan aimed at luxury-minded families, it tried to straddle the line between comfort and practicality, and boy did it fail. It was large, heavy, and underpowered. The drive was cumbersome. Inside, the cabin was a mix of cheap plastics and awkward layout choices, and despite its lofty price tag, it offered nothing that justified calling it luxury. And, it was a vehicle that could not compete with the Odyssey and Sienna, or even vans like the Ford Freestar. Sales never really took off, and the Entourage quickly disappeared into obscurity, although I will say it kind of paved the way for the Kia Carnival. So there was more to its story, but originally it was not good. Now, Kia's rise over the past 20 years has been pretty remarkable, but in the 1990s, the company was still learning what it meant to make a car that people actually wanted. The Kia Cephia is a perfect example of that struggle. Released in the mid-1990s, it was intended to be an affordable, reliable compact car for the American market, and that just didn't end up happening. Handling was numb and unengaging. The interior was cheap, lots of mechanical issues, also rust, electrical components. This car was not good, and it was also just bland in every sense. Uninspiring to look at, uninspiring to drive, and worst for all for Kia, it reinforced a perception that Kia as a company just made cheap, disposable cars, and in many ways, it took years for the brand to shake the stigma that this vehicle gave them. All right, now let's look at the worst cars from German brands. There are loads of bad VWs, the Phaeton, certain versions of the Jetta for sure, but I think the quote-unquote new, revived version of the Beetle is the worst. Launched in 1998 and somehow lasting until 2019, everything that made the original Beetle a legend was kind of lost on the new Beetle. You know, that simple German engineering that just makes sense was mostly gone, making it unreliable and also really difficult to work on. Certain years are of course worse than others. I think for many, it's also the attempted retro styling that wasn't great, though I will say, it's one of the only retro designs from that era, like the turn of the century, that lasted, alongside the Mini, for example. But neither are my favorite. In the end, the new Beetle was so bad that VW had to eventually get rid of it altogether. Arguably the most iconic vehicle in history, just gone, which is pretty sad. As much as there are versions of the Porsche 924 that were pretty cool, and as much as it can be made into something special, don't cope. There's no getting around the fact that this was not good. It started life not even as a Porsche, but as a Volkswagen project that Porsche ended up inheriting when VW bailed, which should tell you everything. Under the hood was a 2.0-liter Audi engine making barely over 90 horsepower in base form, less power than some economy cars from that era, paired with a buzzy, uninspiring driving experience. The interior plastics were cheap, the proportions were awkward, and while it did help Porsche stay afloat financially, there's no denying it was kind of a betrayal of Porsche's identity, a car wearing the Porsche name but lacking the soul. It was born out of desperation, but Porsche would never again undertake a similar kind of project, and for good reason in my opinion. Now, as many legendary BMWs exist, there are loads of stinkers as well. It really depends on what you prefer or what you hate, I guess. For me, it's the i3. This was meant to be a sort of revolutionary electric city car, proof that BMW could lead the EV future. The car ended up being a stubby little weird carbon fiber box with doors that opened in the wrong order, weird interior, and a driving experience that was just offensive to what BMWs are supposed to be about. The overall design and materials were quirky and, innovative, but also just weird and impractical. It had a laughably short range in its early versions, like 60 real-world miles, and a price tag of over 40 grand, which might be the worst part about the whole thing. For a brand built on performance, handling, driver engagement, the i3 felt like an alien product, much like a lot of other new BMWs, I guess. It was slow, awkward, deeply uncool. Even today, it sticks out in BMW's lineup. Not good. Now, if we're just talking about unreliability, there are a whole host of Mercedes that could slot in. Even some of their most beloved models have specific years that absolutely should be avoided like the plague. As a whole, though, the first generation A-Class has to be the most embarrassing for Mercedes. When it debuted in '97, it was supposed to show that Mercedes could build a clever, compact car for the masses. Instead, it instantly became famous for failing the infamous Moose test, a Swedish emergency lane change maneuver by literally tipping over at 60 miles per hour. Mercedes had to scramble, recalling the first 2,600 cars already sold and retrofitting another 17,000 with electronic stability control and suspension tweaks just to make the thing safe to drive. But the A-Class was still a headache. Its unusual sandwich floor design meant that the little engine sat low and transverse, making it easy to damage and miserable to work on, and if you opted for the CVT automatic, you were pretty much guaranteed a short lifespan. The end results were a car that looked awkward, drove worse, and managed to undermine Mercedes' reputation for bulletproof engineering, all in this one ugly, stubby little package. All right, let's talk about some British companies. I'm sure many of you would point to this new concept car from Jaguar as the worst, but that car doesn't actually exist yet, and I also don't really care that much. It all seems kind of silly to me. I think the title for the worst real Jaguar ever must go to the X-Type. It single-handedly botched their reputation, built on a tweaked Ford Mondeo platform. It was promised as this sporty all-wheel drive entry luxury sedan, but it was all a facade. It's been called a tarted-up insult to a once proud mark and one of the 50 worst cars of all time by Time magazine. Its safety record is ugly. The 2004 model got the worst rating of any midsize sedan for IIHS side impact tests. And on the reliability front, it's a money pit. Automatic transmission failures, drive shaft and U-joint problems, engine cooling issues. In the end, what was meant to be a sort of welcoming door to new buyers for the company, it ended up being a warning sign of just how far this brand had drifted. Land Rover. Just Land Rover, in general? Yeah. It's hard to pick one Land Rover, but I think that the Freelander is often cited as the worst car ever from the brand. Small, underpowered, fragile, leaky sunroofs. This is a car that left owners frustrated, terrible maintenance problems, just an ultimately disappointing package from this once incredible company. Also making the list for Time's 50 worst of all time vehicles, we have the Aston Martin Lagonda. This car was produced from 1976 to 1989, and it promised futuristic luxury in the latest technology. As you may guess at this point, it delivered something completely different. Supposed cutting-edge computer electronics failed constantly. This car was heavy and slow compared to its contemporaries, and the styling, which was meant to be sleek and advanced, was just really awkward and unbalanced. One person on Reddit called it bugly. Beautiful but ugly. Or I guess you could say but ugly. It was ambitious, yes, but in the end, just a failed project. Bentleys are tough because in general, they can be quite unreliable and expensive to repair, but Bentley for the most part does stay in their lane. I will say that the Azure, particularly the first generation model from 95 to 03, is often regarded as the worst Bentley ever made. It did have the brand's signature luxury, it had a powerful V8 engine, but it was excessively heavy, it had a lot of outdated technology that made it feel sluggish and unwieldy. Mind you, this was before VW came along and really modernized the company's production. Early models also struggled with reliability and build quality issues, which is not what you want when you're buying from a brand known for, meticulous craftsmanship. All these factors combined to tarnish the Azure's reputation and cement its place as Bentley's least successful and most criticized model. Now, the Camaro is perhaps the most infamous Rolls-Royce failure, mainly because it failed where Rolls-Royce cars aren't supposed to fail: the styling. Its proportions were so awkward, this overall look was divisive. It was meant to look kind of villainous, but for the average onlooker, it was just a little goofy. And with a price tag of $40,000 in 1976, even the biggest, wealthiest fans couldn't justify it. It was ambitious in concept, and it was extravagant for sure, but it struggled to find buyers. People didn't like it, and it went down as one of the most notorious Rolls-Royce vehicles ever. Now, it's really difficult to point out a specific bad McLaren road car. Now, Formula One cars, that's a different story. But for the road, these are supercars. They're technical marvels. Some of them do have teething issues for sure. I would also say that the Speedtail is kind of ugly. The Arturo for sure has problems, but I would say that the Elva has to be the company's biggest misstep. A $1.7 million roofless, windshieldless roadster. It was launched in 2020 during the global pandemic, originally announced as a 399 unit limited run. Then McLaren cut that to 249, and then they cut it to 149, and even then they struggled to sell them. On paper, it was an insane machine, but in reality, it kind of came across as a cash grab, a hypercar that nobody asked for, and one that didn't really make sense on public roads. It ended up being an embarrassing sales flop for McLaren. For Mini, I think that the Clubman kind of represents the company losing a bit of their identity, but in terms of individual cars, I think we have to go with the Metro. Launched in the early 80s as a supposed modern successor to the classic Mini, the Metro struggled with poor build quality, frequent mechanical issues, and just an uninspiring design. It really failed to capture the charm and the agility that made that original Mini beloved, and it just couldn't live up to the expectations. It was tarnished by British Leyland's reputation, and it's often remembered as a symbol of just bad British engineering at this time. Now, Lotus is difficult. There's of course the Elan M100, which purists didn't like because it was front-wheel drive, it didn't handle like a typical Lotus, didn't follow the Colin Chapman formula, but it was a revolutionary car. Most Lotus cars have had their problems. That's almost just as much part of the formula. Lotus had many poorly marketed cars and misunderstood cars, but you can't really point to one, specific car. For me, it's actually just the recent shift away from all the things that made Lotus Lotus. So whatever this hyper EV SUV is going to be, I'm just already saying that's my pick for the worst Lotus. Now, Morgan is tough. Morgan's vehicles are almost always charming, but one in particular was pretty problematic. So when stricter US safety and emissions regulations arrived in the early 70s, Morgan withdrew from the American market. But then a guy named Bill Fink, a devoted Morgan enthusiast and also dealer in San Francisco, he found a loophole by certifying the cars with their Buick Rover V8 engines converted to run on propane. So for years afterward, these lightweight roadsters carried literal propane tanks just kind of slung on the cars on the rear bumpers. So for example, the Plus 8 propane is a good example. Now let's take a look at the worst car from every Italian manufacturer. When it debuted in 1980, the Ferrari Mondial 8 was immediately criticized for being slow, unreliable, and kinda ugly. Two of those three things are sins that Ferrari should never commit. Its 3-liter V8 produced only 214 horsepower, which had to haul nearly 3,600 pounds of weight, giving it a lethargic 0 to 60 time of around 9 seconds, slower than most hot hatches from this time. The car's Bosch K Jetronic fuel injection was troublesome and difficult to keep in tune. Early Mondials were plagued with electrical gremlins and just poor build quality. The proportions didn't help either. Its unusually long wheelbase and high roofline and flat boxy body made it look just kind of like a stretched 308 gone wrong, more than like a new exotic Ferrari. On top of that, the rear +2 seats were practically useless. Ferrari should have learned that mid-engined cars don't work as 4-seaters. They cramped anyone taller than a child, while the mid-engine layout made service work incredibly expensive, requiring engine-out procedures for pretty much any maintenance. All of these flaws gave the Mondial a reputation as the Ferrari that nobody wanted, a car that had the badge, but just didn't deliver the performance and the beauty and the prestige that is expected from Ferrari. What about Lamborghini? Many people will point to the LM002 as the worst Lamborghini ever, but at least that vehicle was absurd, V12 powered military truck. The real low point in my opinion was the Lamborghini Jalpa, a car that promised to be an affordable entry into the brand, but it ended up almost being like a kit car knockoff of the Countach. Its 3.5-liter V8 made just 255 horsepower, barely enough to get out of its own way in this 1980s supercar scene, and it had bland wedge styling that looked outdated the moment it hit the showroom. The cabin felt cheap, the handling was uninspired, and the performance numbers were pretty embarrassing compared to not only Ferrari, but even cheaper cars from this era. Lamborghini only managed to sell around 400 before pulling the plug, and today it stands as the most forgettable and disappointing Lamborghini ever built. Fiat has built plenty of charming little city cars, but their low point has to be the Multipla, one of the ugliest cars ever. On paper, it wasn't the worst idea, a practical 6-seater MPV with clever packaging, but in execution, it had this goofy, frog-eyed, bulging front end with headlights stacked above the grille in the most awkward way possible. Build quality was not good, cheap plastics, flimsy trim, loads of reliability issues, but the biggest thing is that it became infamous worldwide as one of the ugliest cars ever produced. I'm still not sure how this design made it past, any sort of early stages, but I'm kind of glad it exists. For Alfa Romeo, the honor of worst falls to the Arna, a collaboration with Nissan that nobody asked for. It combined the worst traits of both brands. Japanese blandness with Italian unreliability. It was basically a Nissan Cherry, but with Alfa Romeo Boxer engines stuffed in. Engines that were temperamental, underpowered, and hard to maintain. The styling was forgettable, and of course the build quality was bad. There were rust issues, electrical failures. Alfa enthusiasts disowned it, sales tanked, and the Arna is still remembered as a total betrayal of the Alfa badge. Now Maserati has had its ups and downs, but the Biturbo is infamous for nearly killing the brand. On release, it looked promising, a handsome, compact luxury coupe with twin-turbo V6 power, but in reality, the car was a disaster. The engines were fragile and prone to detonation. The turbos blew up if not meticulously maintained. The interiors disintegrated as quickly as the electrics failed. Rust protection was laughable. Car Magazine at the time called it one of the least reliable cars that you could buy, and the reputation stuck. Instead of boosting Maserati into the big leagues, it destroyed consumer confidence, and it became sort of the poster child for Italian unreliability at this time. Now, the worst Volvo ever, I believe, is the 340 360 series, originally designed by DAF before Volvo took over. These hatchbacks and saloons were underpowered, ungainly, and plagued with quality issues. Also, the CVT transmission was entirely fragile, often failing way before the engine gave up. Rust was a constant issue. Build quality was inconsistent, and the styling was just painfully dull, even by Volvo's standards. Worst of all, they just didn't drive well. Sloppy handling, vague steering, gutless performance. These were Volvos that just didn't have that Scandinavian engineering. For Bugatti, the obvious choice, I think, is the EB110. This car was launched with great fanfare. The EB110, people were really excited about it. It had a 3.5-liter quad turbocharged V12, all-wheel drive, advanced carbon fiber construction. While the tech was all impressive, it was just the execution that was flawed. The gearbox was clunky, the handling was heavy, and the reliability was terrible thanks to all the turbos and complex electronics. It also arrived at the worst time possible. The early 90s recession killed the market for these million-dollar supercars, and Bugatti collapsed in 95 after selling less than 150 examples. Now, the EB110 has been somewhat redeemed today as a really collectible oddity, but historically it was the car that was remembered for not being good enough to revive Bugatti to its former self, unlike, of course, the Veyron. Now, I think the moral of the story for bad cars is that the worst thing you can do is try to step out of your lane and then fail miserably. There are different kinds of manufacturers making different kinds of cars for different kinds of people for a reason, but it seems like manufacturers lose this sometimes. I don't need an economy Lexus. I don't need BMW to make a tiny city EV. It's not that there's anything wrong with these different types of cars, it's just that every company seems to sometimes want to have every part of the market, and that just doesn't work. Now, I would love to hear from you guys. What do you think is the worst car on this list? And make sure to let me know if you think I'm way off on any of my picks. We'll see you guys in the next one. Drive safe.